talks with Vladimir Putin? Well, let's get more with American political strategist and spokesman for the Republicans overseas UK, Erol Morkoc. Erol, thank you for joining me this evening. Are you hopeful that these talks will bring a ceasefire closer?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think all of us have to be, because there's nothing but optimism at this stage, right? We're at the touchdown, airplanes on the ground stage. So there's nothing to be gained from being negative or pessimistic. I think that Donald Trump brings a lot to the negotiations in his personal style. I think that maybe we're going to look at a ceasefire as being the goal of this. And as President Trump has said, he wants to bring in the Ukrainians. He wants to bring in another round. So this is phase one. We want to get to phase two. Let's let them feel each other out. But yeah, I'm very confident, very positive.
Now, Trump came into office promising to end this conflict within a day. Obviously, he's not succeeded. Do you think that he has learned from his first few months of experience in dealing with Zelensky and dealing with Trump? Is he better informed going into this meeting than he perhaps was 6 months ago?
I do think so. I think he had to be cordial. He had to play the digital gamesmanship game he has to do. But in the end, Vladimir Putin was a bad actor. Vladimir Putin didn't come to the table. He didn't hold up his end of the bargain. He would give Trump nice words, but his actions didn't match it. So Trump's much more guarded here. He's much more prepared for Putin's tactics. He remembers the meeting in Helsinki. He remembers how things went last time. I think that all comes into America's favor and to the world's favor as Trump is trying to at least stop the killing. When we can stop the killing, then we can work out the nuance and we can start discussing where you draw borders, where you don't draw borders, where the ethics of this are going to come into play, if at all. But right now, if we can focus on stopping the killing, I think Trump's prior history with Putin is going to be to everybody's advantage here.
But I suppose some would say, why did Trump ever believe that Putin was anything other than a bad actor? It's perfectly possible to discuss pragmatically and logically what Putin wants, but it's very clear that he's not just interested in a few more kilometers of Ukrainian land. There are ideological reasons for this war. He doesn't believe that Ukraine is a legitimate country. He wants it part of a greater Russia. Why did Trump ever believe that Putin could be seen as some sort of business partner that could be bought off with a good deal?
I think it's maybe a little bit of a lack of confidence in the prior administration. We didn't feel that the Biden administration had made any overtures for peace. And if you don't give peace a chance at the base level, at the, let's say, a polite level, you're not going to get to the point where you can have peace at all. So I think maybe it was a little bit naive optically, but in the procedural way you go through things, I think it was necessary to see if there was an obvious peace deal that had just been sitting on the table. Remember, they hadn't met President Biden and President Putin. So, you know, we came in with very little faith in what the prior administration had done, and I feel that President Trump gave perhaps a little bit too much time. But it was from a place of, let's find out before we cross the Rubicon here. And the next step after this, if there is no peace, is going to be escalation from the Americans. So Donald Trump, you know, speak softly and carry a big stick. I think we're at the speak very deliberately part of this negotiation, because, you know, you're right to bring that up. That is something that didn't go as we had hoped.
Now, ultimately, any peace deal that's agreed has to come with a guarantee. What will happen? What consequence would there be should either side breach that agreement? And ultimately, for the Ukrainians, the only safe guarantee is the threat of military action against Russia by its allies, Europe and the United States. But are there any circumstances in which the US would sign up to such a guarantee, where they would, at the last resort, take military action against Russia should they breach any agreement?
No, that would be against every single advice of every strategic analyst in the United States, from Kissinger onward. We would never enter a situation where we have a country on the border of Russia that has a history of land entanglements and have our soldiers and our troops be tied to that kerfuffle. That would be like creating a situation where we're tied to the border of Armenia and Azerbaijan.
But then how can any peace work if there isn't that ultimate consequence of military action if there is a breach of the terms?
Well, I think you have to build that. I think this is a great question, because this is where Europe can step up. This is where Europe can step up with military guarantees. This is where the U.S. can integrate itself economically. You see that deal we made for the resources, that was a 50-50 deal. That's very generous. I mean, in any other situation, it's 90-10 in the favor of the investor. So this is an idea to buoy the Ukrainian economy with not only real infrastructure and investment development, but also defense investment through the Europeans, through NATO, to integrate them farther. So Russia's deterred by the fact that Ukraine would be so strong they couldn't possibly do this again. The United States support should come in a more financial way and also in a training way. But this is a great opportunity for the EU, the Europeans, to step up, back Zelensky, back the Ukrainians, and find a way to make that special carve out for them to be relevant in this situation, because it can't be the responsibility of the young men of Kentucky to go fight in the eastern part of Ukraine if there's a disagreement in 20 years. That's not fair to the American voter.
Isn't the problem here that Russia is a nuclear power, and that's what's made the West nervous all the way through this conflict, not knowing?
Your brand is special, and so is what you do. We are Any Promo, and we help.
And that had this been a non-nuclear power, America and perhaps Europe would have intervened a lot sooner. And that threat's not going to go away, is it? Putin is always going to have access to nuclear weapons. Is there really any prospect of guarantees when those weapons are in play?
I'm glad you touched on this, because not only are they a nuclear power, there are other nuclear powers. You know, I mean, Iran theoretically has some nuclear material. North Korea has nuclear material. We're not afraid of them. You know why? Because if they tried to shoot any of those nuclear missiles, we would shoot them out of the sky. Russia has Mach 10 hypersonic missiles with multi-entries, 5 or 6 multi-entry warheads. So these things can break any defense structure. They could hit London in maybe 5 minutes. So that's what makes this negotiation so impossible, to have the one-sided, oh, you'll come and speak to us, we're the Americans, you'll have to, bend the knee. In this situation, no, they can't match us economically. No, they can't match us in force projection. But in terms of terminal velocity, kill impact, they can outstrip almost anybody in the world, and they can put nuclear weapons, nuclear tips on the end of that. And because of that, you'll never be able to, have the parity or a situation where they're deterred. What you can do is intertwine economic alliances and probably be a little bit more conscientious of their position, not to give them any leeway. But the Americans did promise them, when they removed their troops from East Germany, that they wouldn't push NATO farther to the east. So there is room for us to work with them in terms of not maybe pressuring them, because they are a very violent, aggressive nation run by a man who has no problem putting his own people through the meat grinder. And while that might be unpalatable or disagreeable that we have to sit down and work with those people, the alternative is to continue the killing fields, the 800 miles of trench warfare, and the over 1 million young men died on both sides, young men who probably didn't hate each other. And that's what makes it all even more tragic.
And of course, the Ukrainians will be very aware of previous deals that have not been upheld, where they gave up their nuclear weapons for the promise of peace, where Crimea was invaded in 2014 with no sanctions from the West. But let's talk about Donald Trump's style. He's a very, very unusual, unique president in the way that he operates, and couldn't be in more contrast to Joe Biden, who by the end of his presidency was barely giving media interviews. But now Trump will speak to anyone, anywhere. We've already seen him on Air Force One today, speaking freely with journalists. He shoots from the hip, he says things, he changes his mind tomorrow, but he's very open with what he's thinking from day to day. Do you think that level of transparency is helpful in these kind of negotiations, or should he be holding his cards closer to his chest?
Well, I think kind of what makes it work is Donald Trump, the way that we see it in the media or as just a passerby, we see it as this public diplomacy, the bringing in the South African president or bringing in Zelensky, cameras on the Oval Office couch and going at it, doing this public diplomacy on Twitter or Truth Social. And that kind of puts us in a tunnel vision to think, hey, that's how Trump operates. That's the only way things go on. But one of the interesting things is that distraction allows for Marco Rubio and also for traditional intelligence communications, including by the president, that aren't reported, to continue on the back door. So I think it's something that we should be cautious of thinking is fully transparent. Like, we think it's all transparent because what we see is close to what we get. but there's a lot of things that go on the back end. So while Trump is bombastic, while his style, I think it can inspire fear in certain leaders, Vladimir Putin doesn't care what Trump is tweeting. Vladimir Putin only cares about what goes on in that meeting, and that meeting is going to be behind closed doors. So I think it's a little bit of a quid pro quo for the strategic viewpoint of this, but I think that perhaps we have a myopic vision of it because we have been so accustomed to seeing it in the front row that we don't know that he does conduct traditional diplomacy. And this is going to be much more traditional, much more by the book, as you might expect, especially with Marco Rubio there.
I wonder what you think about how the British press report on Trump and portray his presidency. And I certainly think that his first presidency, much of the British press mocked him, thought that he was a failure, couldn't understand why Americans had voted for him. And yet this time, although there's obviously still an awful lot of criticism of Trump, he's not especially popular amongst the majority of voters in the UK, there nevertheless is a grudging respect for him this time in Britain. The mainstream media are taking him more seriously. Have you noticed that? Do you think it's something that Trump has changed, or just a pragmatism, understanding that he's here for some time?
Yeah, I suppose perhaps it's respect is earned and not given. And even if it's begrudging, I think a lot of people, love him or loathe him, can't deny that the man ran the gauntlet. And very few people, like one thing you'll see with leaders oftentimes is they'll admit on camera, hey, I had nothing to lose and I went for it. Well, Donald Trump had everything to lose, and he went for it. And while people can dislike that, people also do see the inherent risk of putting the cards on the table, winning, and then conducting yourself in this way. And I think, game recognizes game, and people who are talented and doers in the world see Donald Trump through a lens of that's somebody who can do things. The British people are successful people, hardworking people, and I think ultimately their politicians realize that an alliance with Donald Trump, who's a natural Anglophile, is only going to be better for the UK. The special relationship, people can think it's real, people can think it's more of a symbolic thing, but Donald Trump is the kind of guy who you can actually use that to your favor with. So I think it behooves everybody to take advantage of President Trump's natural likeness for the United Kingdom, and perhaps that's come through. He is a taxpayer in the UK. He owns multiple businesses throughout Scotland, and I think it's something to be said for that, and maybe the British people have come around to it at least marginally.
Well, we're seeing pictures of Vladimir Putin's plane arriving in Alaska, the Russian leader on that plane there, getting ready for this much vaunted summit with Donald Trump, a summit that the Kremlin have said may last 6 to 7 hours. So an awful lot to be discussed. Erol, do you think the really fine-grained details of land and military might and perhaps mineral deals are all going to be discussed? 6 or 7 hours is a long time for a broad-based discussion. Are they going to be getting into the nitty-gritty of what comes next?
Well, from what I've heard, President Putin has brought along some of the businessmen, oligarchs as we call them, with him that are sort of intertwined. So we might see some discussion on the economic side, and that might include minerals. That might include Russia's minerals. I mean, Russia's the #2 supplier of aluminium to the world. Russia now is forced to sell all of it to China, which only brings Beijing and Moscow closer together. So in a weird way, by buying their aluminium, we could actually reduce this dependency. There's all these little weird things that would be nitty-gritty that if you're there for 6 or 7 hours might talk on. One thing that everybody in the media has been cautioning, well, everybody I guess anywhere has been cautioning Trump about is don't get sucked into talking about the land swaps at this stage. Because obviously the land swaps mean Ukrainians trading their own territory to themselves. It's like the other guy stole your chips and is like, well, I'll give you back something. So it's not exactly a swap in the same context. And obviously that's something that Trump has said, hey, Zelensky needs to be in the room. Perhaps the Europeans can be involved. So the goal is to stay away from that discussion beyond a tangential sort of understanding that there's been a lot of lives lost, and trenches draw the borders a lot better than guys with maps and glasses. So that's going to be probably where it goes. But I think ultimately this is going to come down to narrowing down what a ceasefire means and what that means in terms of guarantees that both sides can give each other for that ceasefire to stay implemented. Because if you have a ceasefire and then it's broken immediately, there's no value to this meeting, and we're back at square one.
Now, many commentators believe that the reason that Trump is so keen to see the back of this war is because he doesn't see Russia as the real enemy. He doesn't see Russia as incompatible with the West. The real competitor for the US is China, and he wants to be free to focus his attention and his competitiveness on Beijing. Do you think that's fair? There's been lots of talk about Trump wanting to do a reverse Nixon to separate Russia from the Chinese, to reduce the power of that alliance. How far ahead into the future is he going to be looking?
Yeah, I think that really encapsulates his viewpoint. I mean, Russia is a majority Christian nation. They have European connections. We feel that maybe there's a way to work there in the future. Why don't we try to build a bridge there? They're also, they're not a small country. People like to castigate them as, oh, they have an economy the size of like Portugal. But in terms of like PPP, like purchase parity power, they're the fourth largest economy in the world. So like functionality, it's very different. China, though, is a competitor that's actually taking on our industry, taking on our entrepreneurship, taking on our automobile sectors, jobs that take pensions and that are union jobs. And that's where Trump's new voting base is as the union president, the president of the working class for the first time in the Republican Party in like 60 years. So I think that's kind of why he sees China more as an economic threat. Russia is not an economic threat in a direct sense to the United States industry like Russia is in sort of like global industry, large scale projects, but not in like the way that TikTok or Alibaba can compete with a Facebook and an Amazon. These are the kind of reasons why Trump sees China as sort of the competitor of the future and why he wants to pivot. And the U.S. entire policy wants to pivot towards Asia, by the way. And that's something that's really important for us as Europe, kind of gets back on its own feet and goes forward. And keep in mind, in NATO, actually, Hawaii is not included. We're the only country in NATO to not have our entire country included because of the Pacific being such a different thing. So as the U.S. turns to that theater economically, militarily, obviously, we will too. So the faster we can wrap this up and Europe can kind of take hold of its own problems, the faster we can focus on looking eastward.
Well, Erol, thank you so much for your time this evening. Thank you for joining us on GB News. Now, we're now joined by US political analyst Eric Ham. Eric,